bit, but no worries. No worries. They say we help with that.
Oh, you want to go? I'll go.
Don't worry.
Americans of free to work to build a nation of widening opportunities. Now, our generation of Americans has been called on to continue the unending search for justice within our own borders. We believe that all men are created equal, yet many are denied equal treatment.
My name is Jeffry Fletcher. I am the Executive Director of the Ruby and Calvin Fletcher African American History Museum. It was a challenge, to say the least. We had to repurpose, we had to rewire. Ruby and Calvin Fletcher, my parents, were the motivating factors behind this whole museum. My mom, who was a child, who grew up in Camden, South Carolina during the 1930s, she decided that she had enough of living in Jim Crow South and dealing with the segregation, discrimination, and migrated to the Northeast. Was the main force behind where we are today. And as a child, what she did was she collected a lot of objects, a lot of artifacts. She continued to collect, and as she was raising her family. One thing I hope people will take away from this museum is to understand and open up their minds that this history, these artifacts, this museum is a place where African American history is preserved. But the thing that I want people to understand that it plays a big part in breaking down the stereotypes, the bias, and all of the negativity that has been associated with African Americans from the first time they set foot in 1619, Virginia, to up to this point. I'm trying to break down stereotypes. I'm trying to break down bias. We tend to forget where we came from. This museum puts everything in perspective, but it also brings you back to reality of what happened in America 300-400 years ago. This history is not going to hurt you. And one of the things that I really, really drive home, and my staff drives home, is we are not wanting anybody to feel shamed. I don't want anybody to come through the museum feeling as though they're going to be persecuted. We actually do tours where we take people through the museum so that if there are any questions, they can be answered right then and there. And this is not a place where you need to be afraid to ask a stupid question, because there is no stupid questions here. This is the place to do that. Sometimes I have to sit and reflect on the journey that this has been on. I came from bringing things out of my trunk of my Jeep, just lugging things at early hours of the morning, and speaking to people and hoping people would want to open their doors, hoping schools would open their doors, hoping civic organizations would open their doors, and even sometimes African American or urban communities would embrace this. It's a little emotional for me because it's been a long journey, not only for me, my mother, other people, African Americans, and we gotta support each other, and we gotta make sure that we don't let history repeat itself. I think my mother and father would be proud of what they see here, but I think they would walk a little cautiously, because you have to remember, they came up through a period of time where my mom especially, have seen houses burn, people incarcerated, her own father incarcerated for 30 days for not making the oldest children work the fields because they lived on a sharecropper's farm, which was one of the reasons why she migrated to the north, because she didn't want to live like that anymore. My mom and dad would walk very cautiously because it has a lot to do with trust of where they came from. But they would they would be proud of what was going on here today.
Welcome. My name is Doug Nygren. I'm chair of the Slavery in Guilford, Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford organization. We are sponsored by the Guilford Preservation Alliance, and I thank them and its leader. And I thank the library for their cooperation in having this presentation this evening and for 3 more talks that are coming up this year. Our focus is on slavery in Guilford. That's a narrow focus. Our speaker tonight has a wider focus. And he will be talking, as you can see from the beginning, about our nation. Our focus, our group is on Guilford, but that's part of the bigger picture of the nation. Before Mr. Fletcher gives his presentation, I'd like to express our thanks to the Guilford Free Library for co-sponsoring tonight's talk. And I'd like to thank our team's parent organization, the GPA, the Guilford Preservation Alliance, for their support. I'd also like to thank our team members for their efforts in putting this up. John Callio, would you stand up, please? John designed our poster. Ellen and Michael, would you stand up? They walked around Jeffry and put up the posters. And corrected things that we hadn't seen that were false. Bernie Bitterman, would you stand up? This Bernie proposed the idea of having our speaker this evening, and he has proposed other things on other topics that we have had. He's been a valuable member of our group with many ideas for what things that we can do. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. It's starting to rain, I heard, so this was an effort for you to come, and we appreciate your coming, and I hope you will learn from this just as we are here. Someone asked me, why do you do this? And the answer is very simple, to learn. Welcome.
Thank you. I might have to put this down because my voice resonates pretty loud. So I want to thank the Guilford Public Library and the group that encouraged everyone to come out to see this presentation during Black History Month. So there are a few things I want to say. We all know that I am Jeffry Fletcher. I am the executive director of the Ruby and Calvin Fletcher African American History Museum, as well as the president of the African American Collections Incorporated, which is a 501c3. This endeavor has been a journey, a huge journey, because my background, and I'm going to put a couple things out here first. My background is law enforcement. Well, even going back, 14 years I spent in the Department of Mental Health because that was my degree in college, my degrees in college. So I spent 14 years in the Department of Mental Health. I then had to get a real job, as my wife would say, when I met her. So at that point, I ended up filtering into law enforcement. I have been a 22-year member, retired of the New Haven Police Department. And 2 years as a judicial court, federal court marshal as well. So this museum originated from the motivation, the labors of my mom. And you're going to hear me speak an awful lot about my mom tonight because she was the motivating factor behind where we are today. My dad was her pilot, right? And my dad would have to go wherever she told him she wanted to go find artifacts, look at tag sales, estate sales, and anything else. Matter of fact, my mom drug my dad to a Ku Klux Klan rally in Middlefield. I didn't know that until we were at her funeral, and one of my cousins stood up and started speaking about the things my mom had done. And I looked at my dad, I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, "Dad, did you go to a Ku Klux Klan rally?" He said, "Yes. We went into the grocery store." This is Colchester, Connecticut now. "We went into the grocery store, we came out, and there was a leaflet on the windshield. And your mother saw the leaflet and said, 'I want to go to see what this is about.'" So she went. He drove her, she went. They sat in this field in Middlefield, and probably 20 minutes after they arrived, somebody knocked on the window. And my mom always said this, as my cousin would say, this individual knocked on the window, very polite, and said, "Ma'am, you all are not supposed to be here." Wasn't any violence, wasn't any names hurled back, and they left. That goes to show you who, and I knew that's who my mother was when she was so defiant that that's what she did. She went to a Ku Klux Klan rally and just wanted to see, because she was inquisitive, she was involved in civil rights, human rights, equal rights, and she fought for everyone, the downtrodden. So when you hear me talk about various things in this collection, it comes from my mom and my dad, who's kind of like in the background there, but monitoring and taking her different places. The museum is sponsored by, our seed money comes from the law firm of Sherman and Sterling LLP, which is out of Manhattan, Connecticut, Manhattan, New York. And for folks don't really know who Sherman and Sterling LLP was or is, they were instrumental in giving us the seed money to start this museum. I befriended the general counsel named Bill Roll. And when he heard about my story through the media, he reached out and said, "We'd like to be the pillar to get this museum up and running." And at that point, I thought it was too good to be true. And at that point, he said to me, "Just give me your budget and tell me what you need." And I thought, this is like having a genie and giving me 3 wishes, or 1 at least. So as he told me what he needed in a budget, I then started to do my due diligence and research. What I learned was that the Sterling law firm was affiliated with a gentleman by the name of John W. Sterling, who resided in the town of Stratford, Connecticut in the 1800s. John W. Sterling graduated from Yale in 1865 and Columbia Law School. 2 decades later, he then ended up donating $15 million to Yale University, which they built the Sterling Memorial Library, the Sterling Law School, and parts of the Divinity School. So I said to myself, I hit it big. And the firm said, "We're going to stand behind you until this thing comes to complete fruition and your goals are met." Well, little did I know that they were going to go through a huge acquisition and a merger with one of the bigger law firms in the world out of the UK, Overy and Allen. And they're still crossing the T's and dotting the I's, and boy, can we use their help. Because we are doing everything to make keep the doors and the lights on, the doors open. But we at least know there's a light at the end of the tunnel because we have some great people behind us where that's concerned. Now, one of the things that I also want to put out here, I don't like lecturing to people and presenting things and talking at folks, right? So here's what we do here in my presentations. I often tell folks to raise your hands and ask questions now. Because if you're like me, I can't wait until 45 minutes or an hour later because I'll forget the question. So please raise your hand, ask a question, and I will be able to answer that question. Yes, sir. Got the first one now.
Where is the museum?
I'm going to get to that.
Oh.
Yes, ma'am.
Did the Sterlings have a reason for wanting to support your music? What was their background?
The Sterlings are from Stratford, the Bunnell family and the Sterling family, they're from Stratford, entrenched there. Bunnell High School, Sterling Community Center. They have a long lineage there in that community. So the Sterlings directly did not have an interest, but the law firm felt that they needed to be a part of this. And to answer that question, the museum is located at 952 East Broadway, Stratford, Connecticut, in the historic section of Stratford. So I can see the questions already started. And the thing is, what we try to tell folks is this, is that we don't want anyone to feel as though they're being persecuted. We don't want anyone to internalize this information. I don't want anyone to point the finger and say it's your fault, because if we think about it, a lot of us have not experienced half of this stuff up here. And maybe we have seen a lot, because as I was setting up, I kept hearing in my peripheral there, folks were saying, I remember this being in Pensacola, I remember this being down south, I remember seeing the signs posted in different places below the Mason-Dixon. So in our museum, we stress that too. We do not want folks to feel as though they caused this or created this. And we want to make sure, because it's been politicized, this history. It's been politicized to the point where schools are now looking at banning the books, the history, as well as banning AP African American history courses. And it's as a gatekeeper, it's my job to preserve and to tell this history, but now talk about it as my mom collected it and went through her childhood, bringing it to life, which it is. So my mom grew up in Camden, South Carolina, and she lived on a sharecropper's farm with her 7 brothers and sisters in South Carolina, and my grandparents. As the 2 oldest of the family, of the children, the 2 oldest had to be in the fields. And if we all know what a sharecropper's farm is, if we don't ask, but a sharecropper's farm was where my grandparents and my aunts and uncles had to work the farm in order to live on that property. If they did not work that farm, work that land, then they were put out. So my mom, being one of the 2 oldest, had to go into the fields during harvest and planting time. So you know in harvest time, school starts in the fall, right? And in the spring, it's planting time. So she was pulled out of school often, and she got tired of doing that. She got tired of that whole ritual. She got tired of missing school, as she would say, watching her classmates going to school every day and she missing school. So she decided that she wanted to leave the South at the age of 16, unbeknownst to my grandparents. And when she left the South, it was during the time which we say was the great migration of black folks moving from Jim Crow, looking for equal housing, fair employment across the country. But she had figured out that she needed to come north because she had heard there were people from her community and surrounding areas that were traveling north to a place called Colchester, Connecticut. And that's where I was born and raised. That's where my mom ended up going to, which was Colchester, Connecticut. How many folks know where Colchester is? Okay. So Colchester was a community that was inhabited by the Jewish faith, a large population of Jewish folks that lived there. And when my mom arrived to Colchester, because there was nothing but chicken farms, egg farms, dairy farms up there, right? And she had nowhere really to live. And she was taken in by a Jewish family. Not as a domestic, not as a cook. Yes, ma'am?
Was she by herself?
She was by herself. And she had collected objects at the early age of 16 and bought whatever she could north. And they were like bric-a-brac, kind of like ephemera. If you all don't know what ephemera is, signage, paper goods, and little books and things. And she packed all those things up and came up by bus. And for a 16-year-old traveling during that period of time in Jim Crow South all the way to the north, must have been frightening. So when she got to Colchester, she was taken in by a Jewish family. She was educated, taught their culture, their spirituality, their faith. And two things that they told her was this, and she always repeated this to us. They always said to her, never forget where you came from. That was one, right? The other was, never forget what had happened in Germany, another hemisphere across the other side of the world. Never forget that. So when I tell folks that I had the best of both worlds growing up in Colchester, I had the best of both worlds growing up as a Baptist Protestant as well as in the Jewish faith. We celebrated the Jewish high holidays. I tell folks I spent more time in synagogue than I did in church. I tell people I've gone to more bar mitzvahs and bas mitzvahs than most of my friends. I learned a little bit of Yiddish. And the one thing is that my mom, I just learned this maybe several months ago, that she was one of the best Jewish cooks in the community, in the town. And when the rabbi came in from New York to bring delicacies to the synagogue, the B'nai B'rith, the women of the synagogue, would call and say, Ruby, the rabbi's here, come on up. And he has kosher chickens and all sorts of delicacies that the Jewish faith indulged in. And so we grew up in a great household, and I thank my mom for that. Now, she would not have known, and she did not know this was going to happen. And how that story goes is, when she passed away, I get this call from my mom, my dad, that there were a bunch of items that were left. Now I gotta go backwards a second here. So when I came home from college, I would always go, because I was a student athlete at the University of New Haven. So when I come home on my breaks, I'd always go to my bedroom, and my bedroom was converted into a storage area with cataloged crates and different things. And I would say to my mom, why don't I have my bedroom? Where is my bedroom? Don't worry about it. Go to your brother's bedroom, and that's where you'll stay. I had no concern about these objects up here, because I used to call them junk. I used to say it was junk. And my mom was like, these objects are going to mean something someday. They're going to amount to something one day. But I always thought she meant monetarily. But guess what? I'm learning that it had nothing to do with money. It had to do with preserving, teaching, educating, enlightening. But back then, at the age of 20, 21, this stuff was considered junk to me, and all I wanted was a place to go to bed, wake up, have dresser drawers, and a bed. So one day I came home, I decided to be smart-mouthed, and I came home, and I was just so tired and frustrated. So I looked at my mom. I went in the den, because my mom and dad were down in the den watching television. So I was so frustrated, I went down in the den and I said, I looked at my mom, I said, you remind me of this man, gray-headed man, out in Watts, California, Los Angeles. And he collected junk. So we're all old enough to know where I'm going with this one. And I finally said, you remind me of Fred Sanford, Fred G. Sanford. Because Fred Sanford thought of everything that he collected was going to be valuable, was going to be real, it was going to be of something, right? And my dad would sit there and he'd snicker and laugh. And I look at him and I said, you're no worse. You're like the son, Lamont. So my mom finally got tired of my opining on her objects, and she would say, you go back to your palace in, at that time again, Branford, believe it or not, where I live. Go back to your palace in Branford. I like what I like and you like what you like. So I would go. But when I got that dreadful call that night that my mom had passed, my father said that you need to come home because your mother packed up a whole lot of things for your brother and your two sisters. Now, my mom was of the mind, everything that we had as children growing up, pre-kindergarten, those ugly little, what do you call those, pot holders that we made with our handprints on them, those ugly ties that we made for my father for Father's Day, and any certificate, any paper, any mortarboard, any graduation gown, every trophy, every plaque, every certificate, she saved. And her rationale for that was, she said, you, your brothers and sisters after college, when you all graduate from college, you're going to be transient. You're going to be moving 3 or 4 times before you settle down. And to that, she was absolutely right. Had we taken those things, because her feeling was we should have things to show our children of who we were and where we came from, as if what she's done. So when I went home that next day to see what was in the house that I thought would be just mine, I thought it would be just one Rubbermaid crate, right? Nope, there were like 12 Rubbermaid bins that you see at Home Depot. And inside those bins were a lot of this stuff, but I thought I just had my stuff. And my dad said, no, your mother left this stuff for you. I said, what in the world? What am I gonna do with this stuff? Now I'm just transitioning out of law enforcement. And so as I got home, made several trips back and forth to Colchester, to Brantford, to Colchester, drug my poor daughter with me. She was in high school at the time. So we finally got the last load in the house, in the basement. And I started unloading everything, which was probably half the size of this basin here, right? And finished basement and everything. And my daughter looked at me, she said, Daddy, Mama, meaning my wife, Mama's not gonna let you keep this stuff here. What are you doing? She's gonna have a fit. Sure enough, my wife comes downstairs, get this stuff out of here, you're a hoarder, you're a hoarder. And I said, no, I can't do anything with it. So at that point, what did I do? I said, okay, I thought about it. So I'm standing with my daughter, my wife goes back upstairs, and now I pick my phone up because the smartphone can tell you to do everything, right? Tell you where everything is. I start Googling 1-800-JUMP. I still didn't have any sense of what this stuff meant. So as I'm dialing 1-800-JUMP, I look, I pick the phone up, and I'm like waiting for it to come on, and it's ringing, and then all of a sudden, I got this excruciating, numbing pain that radiated in my eardrum, down the side of my neck, down my arm, and I threw the phone down, and my daughter looked at me and said, Daddy, what's wrong? I said, I don't know, Victoria. I said, this hurts really bad. Now, first thing she's thinking is, I'm having some sort of stroke, maybe, a heart attack. And then she looked at me and she said, Dad, you know what that means? And I said, no. She said, that's Grammy telling you you better not get rid of her stuff. So that was the beginning to where we are today. And I had to go into this story like that because folks are going to ask, how did I get involved in this? And so that's the story of how I got involved in this. So I ended up trying to figure this out, sat on it, left law enforcement, got that great deal with Chairman Sterling, and now I had to go present this to the world. Because now I thought I had the pieces to everything. I can conquer all the social ills, I can conquer all the stereotypes and all the bigotry, bias, and so forth, right? So I said, where's the best place to do this collection and get a start, get a foot in the door? So my mom and dad were people who were very transparent, very simple people, very honest, very open people, right? Because that's who they were, that's who they are. My mom, it was either you loved her, you hated her, it was right or it was wrong. No in between, no gray shaded areas. So here's what I decided to do. I said, okay, I spent 22 years in the city of New Haven, and I said I spent 5 years on loan to the Board of Education of New Haven because of my background, my education. They put me in the school as a liaison from the police department to the Board of Education. So I spent 5 years there in Hillhouse High School. And I saw a lot of things that our African American and brown students were not getting and were not understanding because a lot of things start at home. And so at that point I said, let me return back to the city that I protected and served because folks look like me. They looked like me. And so as I knocked on that door, and I asked, could or would you all support this collection somewhere in the city of New Haven? What do you think the answer was to that? No. I hurt so bad, I couldn't figure it out. My mama wasn't alive because she was my everything go-to, and she would usually help me figure things out, always. And I had nobody to help figure that out. So I couldn't figure out why. Don't call us, we'll call you. So I said, okay, it must be just New Haven. I thought maybe because, you know, I'm not from New Haven, I'm not entrenched in the politics and the nepotism that goes on in there, because New Haven's a strange beast, right? It's a strange animal there. I'm not from there. So I said, let me try Hartford. So I say all this, not as a grievance, I say all this because we speak truth and we speak honesty in our museum as well as when I come out here to do these presentations. I'm not trying to throw shade on anybody or any municipality, but I gotta speak the truth. So I went to Hartford, did the same thing. Went to Bridgeport, did the same thing. Went to Waterbury, did the same thing. And I said, well, you know, everybody's telling me this is not needed. But I said, I gotta stay at this because it has to get needed, it has to be needed. I mean, this is history. This is nothing that's gonna shame anyone. Until one day I started getting these calls to come to Stratford to work to schools and show these presentations in the senior centers and do a whole bunch of other things in that community with this collection. Still not knowing if I want to have a brick and mortar museum. So as I'm going into this town for about 2 years straight back and forth, I'm still scratching my head, still trying to figure out why people that look like me did not want me. I said to folks, I even went back and said, I'll give you this collection. I'll let you do it, let you have it, to present it. No thanks. Until one day, the mayor of Stratford, by the name of Laura Hoydick, she had just won her second term. Here's the thing, she's a white woman. She's in a different political affiliation. I'm a Democrat. She's a Republican. We were in I don't want to call it the post of the last administration, because we're still in there, right? And one thing we do at the museum, we don't bring politics into the museum. We leave that on the outside. I don't care what your politics are, you're not bringing it into the museum. But I just had to throw that out there, because Mayor Hoydick, when she came to me, I was like, well, something's up here. Something's happening here. This white woman wants me to come and bring this museum to this town, and the demographics don't look like me. The people aren't the majority. They are still the minority. Why am I coming here? And I had one eye open. As the late Joe Madison from Sirius Radio used to say, I listen with the third ear and I look with the third eye all the time. And I had people coming to my door telling me that she was this and she was that and she was all this. But guess what? That rumbling stopped, because everything I asked of her, she produced. And her administration was Republican too. And to this day, everything I asked, she's got it for me. They found a historic home for me to be in. They bought a historic home, which is John Sterling's home that we will be in next year this time around the corner. They bought John W. Sterling's childhood home. So I say I'm blessed for that. But again, this museum is a litmus test. The objects is a litmus test for what we want, what we need, and what we should have. And trust me, I've seen it on both sides, black and white. So I've seen it from both sides, black and white. So I'm going to get right into these objects. And please ask questions. There are no dumb questions. There are no stupid questions here. This is a place where you ask those questions. And by the way, I want to credential myself right now. I am not a history teacher. I am not an expert. I am not an anthropologist. And I know what I am, the worst nightmare for a curator. Yes.
I just wanted to get some clarification. When you said you see it on both sides, what were you specifically saying?
Well, I get black folks that will tell me, we've seen this before, we are depressed. I'm glad you asked that question. I'm going to try to say this as really succinct as I can. So when they tell me that they've seen this information before. And it's so hard, it's so difficult, and it's a struggle. I say to them, there's only one person that I know of in my lifetime that could say that. She's no longer here, but I can remember her being the matriarch of my mom, my maternal side, and that her name was Miranda Reeves, and she came up from South Carolina, Camden, South Carolina, after my mom did. That was my great-grandmother. And she was born in 1870. And when I was in college in 1983, she passed away at the age of 117 years old. So I have oral history from her. And imagine, what happened in 1863? The Emancipation Proclamation was signed, correct? Right? And then, somewhere in there, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So several years later, 5 years later, 6 years later, she was born, but smart enough to understand the repercussion of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, but also lived during the Reconstruction of the South after the Civil War. And she had all her faculties when she passed. And she was given the gold key to the town, but also given citations from the White House at the time and the governor, which happened to have been, I think, Governor O'Neill maybe, back then. So when we talk about receiving it from the other side, I have black folks that often will tell me, we don't want to see this because we've already seen it, that was then, this is now. But then I get white folks who will say, we have a difficult time with this because it makes us feel shameful, it makes us feel guilty, my children might feel hurt by it, there might be some psychological repercussions behind it. And I say this, what is your name? Linda. Linda. So if Linda came to my museum, or if Linda came after my presentation and she said, you know, Mr. Fletcher, Jeffrey, I feel a certain way. I feel a hurt in my stomach. I feel, you know, there might be a little shame, guilt here. I'm feeling this way, and I'm internalizing this information, and I'm going through all of these horrible things that I can't find my way to the next day to do and be productive. I'm going to say to Linda, then you and I go over here, let's go sit down and talk about how we can make some money, because we'll make a whole lot of money. And what that means is, I know enough media people, I know enough advertising companies that we could sit down and sell your story. Why do you feel that you have to internalize this information, right? Why are you feeling so guilty? And we all know about post-traumatic stress disorder, right? We know what that is, we know the definition of that. Anytime you've experienced a trauma, an issue where it has conflicted you in life, keeps you from doing your day-to-day activities because you have dealt with that stress, that trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. So what I'm going to say to Linda, then you must have dealt with some of this stuff that's up here, that's oppressive and hard, and you had something to do with this, right? I'm going to say, no, you didn't. And if you did, if you say that, I'm going to say, give me what you've eaten and give me what you drank, because I'm going to feel the same way you felt. That makes you internalize this information so hard that you cannot see beyond the fact that it's used as history, it's used as enlightening, it's used as educational pieces, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? No? All right. So these objects that you see up here, I am a curator's worst nightmare, right? I'm the Peabody Museum's worst nightmare. I'm the British Arts Museum's worst nightmare. I'm the Mystic Seaport's worst nightmare, Wadsworth Atheneum, and even the Smithsonian. And the reason why, did somebody, who in here saw me drop some things? Right? And you jump, and I said, I'll explain that later. I didn't do that on purpose. It just fell. These objects up here, especially this piece here, is about 185 years old. Right? And what I do, which I mean is I'm a curator's worst nightmare, I will say, and a lot of these objects have been blessed, right? So you don't have to worry about somebody, or walks in the night, somebody walking through your house saying, why did you touch what you weren't supposed to touch? So what I do is I let the audience hold things, just to get the sense, the gravity, the feeling, the emotions of it. And if you don't want to touch it, you don't have to. But that object there was found in Haiti, and it was used on a sugar cane farm or plantation, because enslaved people would go into the plantations or the sugarcane areas, and they would try to eat the sugarcane because they were lacking nutrients, they were lacking food, and that would be the only way that they can sustain. And so the owners or the overseers would put those objects around their faces to keep them from putting things in their mouths to eat, right? And that went over your head. And my philosophy is, if it was meant to be broke, this here is 253 years old. If it was meant to be broke, I wouldn't have this here today. So let me tell you, these objects were found in the ground, buried in the ground. So after the Civil War, when the North had invaded the South, they burned a lot of these work farms, forced labor farms, and I'll tell you the reason why I'm saying that. I'll say it again. Work farms, labor farms, they weren't plantations. We have romanticized the word plantation, right? Say it again. We in America have been conditioned to romanticize through Hollywood, textbooks, history books, colleges, everywhere, that plantations were romanticized, meaning that enslaved people, when they lived on these labor farms, forced work farms, that didn't exist. It did exist. And so now what we're doing is that sign that I took off in the front, Connecticut Freedom Trail, we are around the country changing that dialogue from plantation to work farms or forced labor farms, because we know what Airbnbs are, right?
Yeah.
Right? And when we go to an Airbnb, what do? We go for a respite, we go for a vacation, and an experience, right? So about a month ago, I'm not a big Facebook person, as the head librarian knows. She helped me to get through the technology to get this going, right? So I just happened to notice on Facebook, one of my friends posted a picture of he and his friends in Virginia on a labor farm, but in the backdrop was the big house. And where they were inside an enslaved shack, which once housed oppressed, enslaved African workers that sweat, that bled, and also died in those dwellings. So what this resort did was, they said, we're gonna modernize this, and we're gonna put running water, heat, air conditioning in them, and we're going to give folks an experience. Right? So when my friend showed up on this, I saw his picture. They were standing outside this enslaved shack, and the backdrop was the mansion or the big house. The only thing that was different was there was a motor vehicle that was in the back. So if you remove that motor vehicle and you just saw them in front, you would say that they turned the hands of clock and they went back into time, and now they are enslaved on this work labor farm. And I let him have it before he even got back to Connecticut. So we're trying to change that narrative from plantation to forced labor farms and work farms. And the Airbnb folks are trying to do the same thing. So, somebody had a question?
Yeah, I wanted you to return a little bit, you may be getting, but what was the structure, legal structure of shared property?
Okay, I'll get to that in a second. So when we talk about Airbnbs, right? So I use this analogy, and I think I'm qualified to do it because I grew up in a Baptist Protestant home and a Jewish faith home as well. And I know a lot of my dear friends who are Jewish. I'm still in touch with them like every other day, every week. And I posed this question to one of my friends, and I said, what if somebody came to you and said that you're taking a trip to Germany and they want to have an experience? They might want to go to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, right? Sounds so sacrilege, so cuts deep to the heart, to the soul. Just even think that somebody would want to have an experience for a weekend or a week and disrespecting those dwellings. It just bogs the mind. Well, now your question was again?
I just wanted to understand the legal structure of sharecropping, how much it did, not then, but after the Reconstruction. You talked about your mother leaving.
So the sharecropping was very important because that was the way of life that they had to rebuild the South, right? And the legal structure was 1863. Slavery was supposed to have been abolished, right? But it wasn't. And some folks will say slavery's still alive and well. And the legal structure then was, the fact is that when my mom was growing up on the sharecroppers farm, that was a legal structure to the folks that owned that property. To them, they were my parents, my grandparents, and my mom, they didn't have any rights. Because if we think about that today, right, people have leases, people have mortgages. They're not forced to do the work on the property, or if they don't, they're thrown off the property. I'm hoping I'm answering that.
So they had no legal ownership.
Nope, they didn't own that property.
Working didn't empower them to have that.
Right.
How did they take that right away?
They didn't take it right away. They had options. They didn't take that right away. What they did was,
No, I'm talking about the Reconstruction in the South. The legal structure of the South.
I mean, we can talk about the whole legal thing, but due to the lack of time, I'm gonna get a hook off the stage, but I'll try to answer that real quick. So during the Reconstruction, when the North came to the South, they burned these plantations, they burned them down. And anytime they wanted to rebuild that property, they had to get money from the North. They were seeking money from the North to rebuild. And that's what I was getting ready to say. A lot of those objects were buried in the ground for a reason, because when these folks were trying to rebuild their plantations or their dynasties, they had to have not to show any complicity in the slave trade. And so the South, and those plantations ended up getting built back up, and families ended up still having money. Case in point, Calhoun, John Calhoun, right? Yale. I mean, you open this door for me now. I didn't want to go down that route. But when you talk about that, you got to talk about, John Calhoun. His family was embedded in the slave trade in South Carolina, and we all know the story. Several years later, what happened here at Yale, more exposure came out. They made the money. That was a dynasty, right? Empire. I wish I had more time. I could really get into the nuts and bolts of that whole conversation. But a lot of these objects, they were manufactured by enslaved people as apprentices and put on them to oppress their behaviors and attitudes. Now I'm going to start flying through this stuff. These objects here were used to keep enslaved people in place when they transported them, either by ship or either by wagon. And how they got their legs, or they not lose their wrists, their ankles. And you can see the dimensions of how big, how small they were. They weren't big people like me. And a lot of these labor farms or work farms, they only weren't used for labor or work. They were used for breeding. Because these individuals were not seen as human. They were subhuman. They were not human to folks. And again, another alert shackle that went around the neck of a human being. This isn't for a child either. And I often tell folks, this is not a stereotype. This is not anything that's any bias or bigotry. So if we run these marathons and we see who wins them, the Boston Marathon, the New Haven Marathon, the New York Marathon, they're using the Kenyans and Nigerians. If you've run those marathons, you see how small those individuals are in terms of bone structure, right? And I also want to dispel another, I'm trying to fly through everything. Africans did not sell Africans. Everybody thinks Africans sold Africans. They did not sell Africans, did not sell each other. If we know about the continent of Africa, there's over 700 to 800 different dialects in that continent, and there are always factoring wars that are going on between villages and tribes. And the Europeans received Africans their villages were taken over. They were the ones that were transported to the coastline of Biafra or Senegambia. They were transported down there and given to the Dutch, Spanish, English, Portuguese to take to various parts of the world, which we call the transatlantic or the Middle Passages. We also in the museum, we jump through the portal and we end up in the early 1900s. And we start talking about these ugly images of stereotypes, bias, and we try to hit everything. We have a space in the museum where we deal with folklore, culture, bias, and deception. And we often use these objects as icebreakers, and we talk about the whole image of where the stereotype came from. All black folks eat watermelon and fried chicken, right? And I tell folks, right, and I use this in object to basically make folks actually tell me what this is. So, for instance, if I were to ask you, describe this for me real quick.
No idea. It's a doll, I guess, or it's a decoration of some sort.
Okay. Fair. A doll, decoration. I'll ask you.
Oh, now you do not want to ask me.
I do want to ask you.
It would be upsetting to me. It is upsetting to me.
And
Because all black people don't like watermelon.
Correct.
And I don't eat a lot of fried chicken.
Okay.
So I want to be healthy.
Okay.
So this would
Can you describe this for me?
It would be an insult to me.
To tell me what it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to help you here a little bit. I'm going to help everybody here a little bit. Because in the museum, we break through these stereotypes, and I respect that. And I respect that, how you described it. Believe it or not, I am so happy because I know that there is a future. I'm very optimistic about our young children. I really am. And I say that only because I spent 2 weeks in the city of Middletown, and I hit all the schools there with this program. And 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds, when I ask them to describe this object, here's what I say. It is a person of color or an African American eating a piece of watermelon with white shorts on and very dark complected and possibly some coarse type of hair. We have to have that honest conversation with ourselves. We really do. No matter how hard it is, we have to have the conversation of what these objects represent. And we have to talk about it. If we can't talk about it, then we're not going to be able to move on. And I respect everybody's view, everybody's opinion, and everybody's thought of how they would describe that. But the honest to God truth is, don't let your lying eyes tell you anything different. Right? This is what this is. And I do eat watermelon every day if I can get it. And I'm like you, I don't eat a whole lot of fried food because it's not healthy for you, right? But my great-granny, when we had functions at her home in Colchester after church, everybody would congregate at her home. The minister, he had to get fed first, the children second, and then the adults. But for dessert, if it was spring and summer, we had pound cake or watermelon, but we didn't have the hybrid watermelon. We had seeds. And so we would often go out in the front of the porch and spit those seeds out. Y'all laughing, y'all know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. So when we were out there sitting in the front of the yard, 15 of us eating pieces of watermelon, spitting those seeds out, my great-grandmother would come out and say, y'all get in the backyard now, and we couldn't figure out why she wanted us back there.
Growing watermelons.
No, she didn't want watermelon. That one, she didn't want watermelon growing in her front yard. She wanted them in the backyard. She wanted us in the backyard because in the day, which I found out 10 years ago as I started this collection, white folks used to drive by down south and take pictures of little black children, and they call them pickaninnies, eating watermelon on the front steps. So my grandmother perpetuated that stereotype, and instead of saying, you stay out there and eat whatever you want, how many pieces of watermelon you want. Now, I only say this because we speak truth to power at the museum, and we call it both ways, but it still does not equal out or measure out for all of the bad things, negative things that have gone on in the African American culture, right? And also, we talk about these images. So if we were to talk about this image here, it's a mechanical bank. And my mom collected about 10, 11 of these, right? We have 2 on display in the museum. This is a mechanical bank. And you put a coin in the hand, and you have a lever on his shoulder, and you pull it back, and the coin goes in the mouth. Now, we would think a lot of this stuff was made where? In the South, right? No?
Yeah.
Connecticut. You say Connecticut. Where do you think this was made in Connecticut? Waterbury. Anybody want to take a guess? No, not Winchester. Hartford. Nope. I'll help you because of time. It was made in Cromwell, Connecticut. And let my good friend Bill and Fran, these are my neighbors here. So you see the back of that. Now I want you to read that out loud.
Jolly.
No, I don't want you to read that out loud. It's bad. It's real bad.
Fat?
Nope.
Which part?
Maybe because of the light. Poor light.
I see bank.
Yep. So, excuse me. So it's really called the Jolly N-word Bank, and it's engraved on the back. Right? It was made in Cromwell, Connecticut, at the J.E. Stevens Company in Cromwell, 1958. They went out of business. So when we talk about Jim Crow, we talk about, and we all know Jim Crow wasn't a real person, right?
Right.
We know Jim Crow was a fictional person who was derived by a gentleman named Mr. Rice in the 1806, and he just perpetuated the lies and the stereotypes. But also, it was used by white businessmen and white politicians to keep segregation alive and well. And so these objects existed across the country. They existed in Europe. They existed in Asia, in Japan. And they're horrendous. And black folks collected them as a novelty. White folks collected them as a dehumanizing conversation to discuss at cocktail parties and events where they can exploit and talk about the perception of Africa. My mom used to use these when we got called. She got called to school, my dad, my mom, and she would use these for me and my brother because we used to act a fool sometimes in school. And she used to bring us and sit us in front of this. And she says, this is how you're supposed to, this is how they perceive you to act. Like a clown, a buffoon, an idiot, right? Somebody who don't have good sense. And she would do this enough to the point where it's ingrained in my brain to know that I'm not gonna get out here and cut the fool, act up, tell jokes, do slapstick and mammy and all that other stuff, right? That's who my mom was, real serious, very serious woman. These magazines up here were in every African-American homes. They were a staple for communication. They told us information that the news wouldn't tell us. Jet magazine. You went to a beauty salon, you went to a barber shop, you went to anywhere where African-Americans frequented, your grandmother's house, your aunt's house, you'll see pictures of Abraham Lincoln, President Kennedy, and Dr. King on the wall in our homes. And these magazines told the story, the real story, showed pictures of lynchings and so forth. But in the middle of the pictures, of the pages of those magazines, there were always the homecoming prom, HBCU queen, beauty queen, African American, and it was kind of like a novelty to have that because it showed somebody that was beautiful and attractive. But Jet magazine was a staple in a lot of African American homes for communication and telling African Americans what they needed to know. I almost forgot. This green book is a replica. It is not of the real green book that I own, right? The real green book that I own, I would not touch it the way I'm touching it now, and I'd be a real curator and paying attention. But this book was the African American or the black person's travel guide. It wasn't a road map, because every state that they went to when they left the north and traveled to the south would tell them where they can sleep. And sundown, we know what sundown houses are, right? Sundown houses was if there was an African American family that lived here in Guilford, and if they wanted to comply and be in this book, African Americans would know that they can come to that home and not be turned away. And it would be a place where they can sleep. Beauty salons, stores, garages where they can frequent, because Jim Crow laws were alive and well all across the country. These are some of the signs, the two replicas up here, right here and right here, but the rest of these signs are real. In Jim Crow laws, signage was very, very important. And if you did not pay attention to them, you would be subjected to harassment, ridicule, and possibly physical violence, and maybe even thrown in a county jail. I mentioned in the video that my grandfather was put in jail for county jail for 30 days. And he was defiant against a sharecropper who owned the property, because my mom was defiant and would fight him that she did not want to go into the fields. And so they took it out on my grandfather and placed him in county jail for 30 days until he realized that he had to come back and tell my mother that she better go into the fields or they would lose their home or be in jeopardy of losing their home. So that was one of the impetus that why she left, was so that she did not continue to keep my grandparents in peril like that, because she was defiant. The sign, colored, right? It was on a bus, Mississippi bus. And everybody thinks that when you got on these buses, these signs were affixed at the top of the bus, but they weren't. So if this was a bus seat and that seat was open and I sat in that seat, but then you got on the bus, I'd have to take this sign and affix it to the back. So every time I had to move back, I would have to take the seat every time a white person came on, and that seat was vacant. So it wasn't like when you came on the bus, you had to look at this automatically. It moved depending on how much space was on that bus. Yes.
Recently, I was talking to friends who grew up in the South about, they said when they were little, they couldn't drink out of, like some of those signs are there. Because I'm a Northerner, injustice feels different to me than it does to them. Because they felt it from a young age. So they feel it, but it's different for me growing up in the North. Because I didn't grow up with seeing those signs. So it's interesting, but just this week, I talked to two people who spent time in the South, and they were talking about how they couldn't drink. And one, she didn't know any different, because she lived here and would go in the South to visit her grandparents, and she drank, and her cousin really got after her for drinking out of the...
Right, so we know the story of Emmett Till, right?
Right. Yes.
Emmett Till came from the north, went down to Money, Mississippi, and didn't really take the Jim Crow signs seriously, because as much as his mother, Mamie, tried to instill in him that you don't go down there and you disrespect any of those signage or anything that has to do with white folks in terms of superiority and going against the grain. And he didn't take that serious. So I can understand that. Growing up and being educated here in the North is a difference. When my brother and sisters, they went south to HBCU schools. And they graduated from North Carolina Central in Durham, which was or is HBCU University and College. When they came back, they had a plethora of information about Jim Crow, about the South, and also about African American history. And so the history that they taught me is when they came back from college every year, because they were older than me, and I learned things that I just didn't know here, because I wasn't being taught it. So that was the expectation. You were not expected to have the same feeling or gravitas as somebody from the South would, or my mother would. But one thing I want to say, my mother saw a lot of turmoil, a lot of adversity, but yet never did she ever tell us or ingrain in our heads that white people were the devil or we needed to hate them. She was a spiritual woman, and she said everybody can be forgiven, but again, she was not a hateful person. These fountains, we leave in the same providence. And I'd like to pat myself on the shoulder because I told y'all I'm not a curator or museum person. So every time I get an opportunity to use a big word like the provenance of it, it makes me sound like I'm really important, right? But we keep everything in its natural condition because it tells a story of how it was used and where it came from. And so that object on the right, we know that African Americans had to drink out of it, and they were not really cared for. In most travel centers or centers where they had water fountains, and white folks used to let their little dogs, if they're carrying them, drink out of this. So again, the last piece, we're almost pretty good. 8:15. Okay, I think I'm in good track right here. The last thing is this hideous object there. You can't talk about African American history unless you invoke the Ku Klux Klan. Just like you can't talk about the Holocaust unless you invoke Hitler and the Nazi regime, maniacal Nazi regime. This object here, I knew this guy. I met this guy. I talked to this guy. So before I left law enforcement, and I told you I was transitioning out of law enforcement, and I had collected my mom's objects before I even decided to do this, but I knew I needed to have something that's going to identify one of the most noxious organizations on this planet, in this world, that menaced African American folks. I knew I needed that Ku Klux Klan hood and robe. So being that I was part of and Bill, don't go back and tell anybody this.
I won't.
All right, you won't. Because he knows why. All right. So before I left law enforcement, I was assigned to Connecticut State Police Task Force, and I was in their Gangs and Guns unit. And gangs and guns. And so what I did was, and I tell folks, especially young folks, when you go online, whatever you do online, and if you're not supposed to be looking at things and researching things, you can get caught, because that information you'll get blocked into, and you don't need to be on there that long because you can be caught and seen. So what I did was I went online and I activated the Vigilante website, and I said I needed an original Ku Klux Klan hood and robe with all of the trimmings. 2 weeks later, I ended up getting a hit. It happened to be, now mind you, it happened to be, and I disguised myself online as a white youth minister trying to embolden the young kids for the Ku Klux Klan and teach them the philosophy and the strength of that. I got a hit for 2 weeks later, and it was a white 83-year-old minister from Boone, North Carolina. And I knew so much about him because you look at his URL, you see his IP address, all of that was exposed, but they couldn't see me because it was all encrypted. So he and I engaged in these really colorful conversations online. We didn't have any telephone conversation, but it was all online. And we talked back and forth, and he wanted to know what I needed it for and how I was going to use it, and he wanted to sell the object to me for $6,000, which I said, you're crazy. And then I told him that I could have that made, and he said that I was crazy because there's only one seamstress in one company in the country that's in Louisiana that makes specifically those objects. You're not going to be able to make them anywhere else. And they had a special stitching and design that's inside that will identify the code and the marking. So after a while, he and I stopped talking, and then we continued, and every day, every other week, I heard from him some of the most disastrous things about African Americans and Hispanic people, and talked about Trayvon Martin being a good N-word is a dead N-word, and talking about Mr. Gentleman that was dragged in the back of the pickup truck in Waco, Texas, and dismembered. He gleefully laughed and joked about that a lot. And he was trying to do it to get a response from me because he quite wasn't sure who I was. But after 6 months, he realized after 6 months, he didn't realize who I was, and at that point, I came out and asked him to sell this object for $600, in which he did. When he sold it to me, I took possession of it, and then, I'm giving you the Reader's Digest, the bridge version of it. When I took possession of it, I came back around and I told him who I was online. But I made a mistake, cardinal sin, in doing any type of undercover work, is I exposed myself too early, and I called him up on the telephone, and he answered it. Instead of saying, who is this, and then saying anything else, he just continued to talk. So no one ever said these people are the smartest people in the world, right? Because I would have asked, who is this, how'd you get my number, and who are you, and all this other stuff. But he sold that to me, and I just felt so guilty because I could not let him get away without knowing who I was. And so I told him over the phone who I was. And it didn't go over too well. He wasn't too happy about it. And next thing I know, he was threatening and doing all these things, but I knew there's a code of ethics that the Klan and the mob have when law enforcement's involved, and it would have been detrimental because I would put him on blast that he sold that to an African American, which is sacrilege within itself. You're either buried in that object or you return it if you're getting out of that organization. So for me to have that, that is like a trophy. So I didn't know at the time that a year later, because when we came out in the newspaper and the media, I didn't know that a gentleman by the name of Spike Lee was in New Haven doing a teaching sabbatical at the School of Drama at Yale. And I didn't know a year later after that, that while I was channel surfing Netflix, there was a movie called The Black Klansman that came out that he wrote. And part of those scenes in there were about my story.
Wow.
But it was an original Colorado police officer that was played by Denzel Washington's son, who started out on the computer. Now we know that they didn't have software, NCIC computer software that we used when I was on the job. So this individual came out back in the late 60s because his goal was to meet David Duke, and which he ended up doing. So Spike took a little bit of my story and made a movie out of it, and we let him know that this is what he did. And we weren't trying to shake him down, but we were trying to tell him that, give us an attaboy and say, you know what, we support what you're doing, and we need to come to your museum. I say all of this only because that was a negative part of African American history, but African American history is not all that bleak, all that solemn, all that dark. There's a beginning, and we have to go through the beginning of African American history and talk about this history before we talk about the good things. These suits up here, because I have other suits that are outfits that belong to celebrities. This suit was worn by Sammy Davis Jr. Right? Sammy wore this. Sammy Davis Jr. was a supporter of Dr. King. He was on the forefront of every civil rights march that Dr. King ever led. He was Dr. King's man of all time. That jacket blazer belonged to James Brown.
Oh, wow.
And again, we want to show the celebratory parts of African American history, but if you come to our museum, when you go through the museum, it is hard. I'm not really doing as much justice, and I always, like my mom said, I can show you better than I can tell you. If you come to the museum, you'll get what I'm saying even when I start in Africa and move through to where we are today. And it's a celebration. When you finish the tour, when you finish my presentation, I always like to let my viewers or my audience know that, you know, we have what we call in the last space, the beginning to the end to the beginning, meaning that there are bright spots in our history that still is left untold and celebratory. And the folks that are in that last space, including myself doing what I'm doing, I stand on some very, very strong shoulders which wore these objects that dealt with all of this stuff up here and allowed me to be here in Guilford standing before you doing this presentation. Had these folks not gone through what they had to go through and continued like my mom and my dad, I would not be here. And these folks who also led the way, they would not have been here either unless those folks, they sweat, they bled, they cried, and they died for us to have this freedom. And the last thing I want to say here is that African Americans did not achieve the civil rights alone. If you look at that video at the beginning when I played that, if you look at the folks that were there were all colors, all hues, all religions, all nationalities that participated in that protest in 1964 at the mall, Lincoln Memorial, where everybody participated in that. So it wasn't a single race effort. Everybody participated in creating the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. And on that note, I think I'm a minute over. I want to thank everyone for coming out here this evening and spending this time with me and with us. And I also am so happy that moving on, I will be talking and preaching your praise wherever I go, because this was very, very good turnout, and I thank you again for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Can you hear me? Thank you, Jeff. You can hear me, I can hear you. Yes. We met with Jeffrey 2 weeks ago, and we spent 2 hours with him. It felt like 45 minutes. And when we went through the museum, it was interesting, and I came to this jelly bean bowl, and I was fascinated when I saw it. I said, what's this? He said, this is what you have to guess how many jelly beans are in there to vote. And then next to it, there is a sign that says, piece of paper says that in order to vote, you have to be able to recite the first 2 lines of the Constitution. This is what people who have not been educated and were illiterate had to do to vote. And I thought it was an experience where you saw part of what it was like. And then in the next room, on the wall, there's a guitar. And I'm a musician, and I love music, and I could think of music as life. That was Jeffrey's father's guitar, and 2 of them, yes. And so I recommend you all go down. It's a manageable museum, and you'll find it enlightening and educational, and it's a good use of your time.
Do you have to book tours ahead of time, or can you just do it on the day you go?
No, let me real quickly. No, it's open to the public, and we just suggest if you come with a group larger than 10 to book an appointment. But if you want to come randomly, come down. We're there. I'm there 7 days a week, and even the days that were closed. And my wife likes to say that's my second home, right, away from home. And if you come down there and you see a black SUV in the driveway, even though it says closed, we're not that big, and I'm not that removed that I can't open the door and let folks come through. And I'm my admin person's nightmare because she thinks I'm too accessible.
So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. The next talk is on the 21st of March. And Connie Royster will talk about her aunt, who was the first black federal judge, and for whom a postage stamp is now available at the press. And she's a very good speaker, and we hope you all come. And one last thing, Larry Manley, are you still here? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Feel free to take pictures if you want to take pictures. Okay with you?
Yes, please.
Yes.
What?